As you sow evil, so shall you reap evil. Crime does not pay. The shadow knows.
Shadow. No man living has ever seen the shadow.
Don't do that.
Who are you?
The shadow. Surely you're not afraid of death. Does crime ever pay?
The shadow will see that justice is done.
And her revenge for your mockery will be death. This is the shadow.
In my previous video on the character in question, I made it clear that the Shadow, more than the mere obscure figure he's seen as today, was at one time a maven of all media, staking his commercial claim from radio to coloring books and beyond, and today's video aims to present just a fraction of that, along with some of the source material that shaped the Shadow into one of my favorite characters on planet Earth. Like the Punisher with a purpose, for over 8 decades, the Dark Avenger has warred on crime relentlessly, his twin 45 Colt automatics dispensing death to the dregs of humanity with laser precision, a master of stealth and subterfuge, a practiced manipulator whose face can be changed at will. In fact, it's even hinted that the Shadow's true identity, former World War I aviator Kent Allard, may have been so hideously disfigured in a plane crash that beneath the Lamont Cranston veneer is a disfigured Rorschach of mangled features.
A light appeared in the corner of the room. It revealed a small table upon which rested various articles of makeup. The Shadow seated himself before the table, but only his white hands appeared within the sphere of light. The hands appeared with what seemed to be a thin mat of wire gauze, no more than a skeleton framework filled with a few solid patches. The object disappeared as it was raised into the dark. Into the range of light came a head and a strange, weird reflection from the mirror. It was the image of a man who seemed to have no face, guised with the colorless surface of the thin mask. Only the Shadow's eyes were visible as they glowed through a plastic mass of grayish blur. The hands came into action. The long fingers moved here and there about the table, finding objects that they needed. Upon the artificial base, the semblance of a human countenance was forming.
The fiction is deep, the character's appeal is vast, so kick back, grab a cloak and a fedora, and re-enter the obsidian depths of the Shadow. Where the massively popular Shadow radio show is concerned, we have to establish several mitigating facts outright. This is not the same character from the comics and the pulps, though there are a fair few areas of overlap, from cast to tone to the overall nature of the character in question, and even perhaps a few areas where the radio version is at an advantage over his pulpy predecessor. Going in, a true Shadow fan must first establish a clear line of demarcation betwixt the two. The Shadow of the Pulps is an agent of incorruptible vengeance, an elemental specter made flesh to haunt the minds of the guilty. He does not shrink from nor lose the opportunity to murder the guilty, cackling at their misfortune all the while. The radio Shadow, bound as he is by the strictures of the Hayes production code, possesses no such compulsion. Oh, his enemies will fucking fry, alright, but the Shadow himself rarely, if ever, pulls the trigger.
Who spoke?
This is the Shadow.
The Shadow? There's no shadow in this room. It's all bright light and beautiful current. Stop laughing.
What a fool you are. You love death so dearly that you want to die?
No, I don't want to die. I wouldn't be able to continue with my execution.
But you will die for the murder of 3 people in this house.
Oh, no, not me. There'll be no one to tell. No one will know. After this pretty girl dies, no one will live to tell.
The Shadow knows, Ben.
Where are you? Come out and fight.
You'll be brought to justice, Ben.
I will not.
You'll pay for your crimes, Ben. There is no escape.
I could find you. I'd be safe. I would.
There is no escape, Ben. You'll burn for murder. You'll burn.
Burn. Yes. Yes, burn. I have my own switchboard.
Don't touch those wires.
It's going to save me all my life. It'll serve me in death.
Stop!
In that sense, the Shadow is still very much like the Punisher, but with a dick, and comics that are actually fucking readable. But in the radio incarnation, at least, they have to think of more clever ways to dispose of Lamont Cranston's adversaries, from terrifying them until they die of a heart attack, to hypnotizing them into committing outright vehicular homicide.
Careful. There's a truck coming down the road. Better sound your horn.
Good Lord, the fool's taking up the whole road.
It's going to hit you. Look out.
It's gone. There wasn't any truck there.
No. I willed you to see it. And you saw it.
No truck at all. Just hypnotism. Gosh, I'm having hallucinations.
But that's the way to dispel hallucinations. Drive straight through them. Be careful. We're near your house. And this old mill road is tricky.
What about it?
Look, Sneed. There's a man in the road ahead of you.
There is, eh? Really?
Why, it looks like one of your two pals that called on you today. I knew he would be here, Sneed.
Really?
You're going to hit him if you don't watch out.
More of your hallucinations. You think that I'll believe you again, don't you? Well, I won't.
Look out.
I hit it.
This time, it was no hallucination, Sneed. He was in front of you.
So it's not that the Shadow isn't a killer, he just happens to be a fucking craftsman about it, which some might even argue is innately superior to his lead-lobbing doppelganger in the Pulp. So no, from his invisibility to his hypno powers to his friend and companion Margot Lane to his cut-and-dry Lamont Cranston alter ego, this is not the same character as the one Walter Gibson envisioned. But it is a goddamn entertaining one. While several actors don the cloak and perform the character over the airwaves, footage has survived of just 5 of them. Frank Reddick, perhaps best known as the reporter in War of the Worlds.
I alone know, for I am the Shadow.
Inimitable uber genius and inveterate bullshit blizzard Orson Welles.
You've gotten your targets mixed. Haven't you, Keegan?
Who's that?
Aren't you surprised to find yourself shooting at a wax dummy?
Come on out in the open. Who are you?
I'm right here with you. I am your Shadow.
Classy, somewhat comedic placeholder actor Bill Johnstone.
It's the Shadow, Dr. Giles.
Shadow.
So sorry to interrupt your labors.
Captain of the USS Enterprise John Archer.
By killing you, the Destroyer has revealed himself and destroyed his secret. The Shadow knows.
And my personal favorite, at 10 years, the longest-serving Lamont Cranston, a shockingly talented actor by the name of Bret Morrison.
Weed of crime bears bitter fruit. Crime does not pay. The Shadow knows.
Sadly, the only one anyone seems to remember these days is Orson Welles, but believe it or not, his version of the show, the serial drama we of course know and love today, was in actuality a reboot. Beginning as the ethereal supernatural narrator, a kind of urban crime Greek chorus, for the Detective Story Hour, the show eventually became simply known as The Shadow, with the titular character, played at the time by Frank Reddick, not serving in any active capacity in the Mystery of the Week drama that played out therein. But with the character upstaging his accompanying program, it wasn't long before readers of The Shadow's prosaic exploits were clamoring for the radio version to reflect the Pulps.
They would gladly do a show with the Shadow based on it. They would sponsor it for 1 year. And if it didn't go over, which they thought it would not, could they then just use the Shadow as an announcer the way they had before? And Street and Smith said yes. So they did it. That was when I got on the first script with Ed Bierstadt, the man that did Warden Laws. I went over to see him, and he's sitting there with a stack of about a dozen Shadows, and has been reading them. And he says, this stuff is good.
So there you have it, an adaptation not identical to its source material, but faithful in spirit, one of the earliest guidelines, in fact, of how to adapt a superhero for alternate media. The end result was, needless to say, superb, as was the decision to cast the indescribably busy, exceptionally talented demigod of drama, Orson Welles to the lead. I find there's a simultaneous overcorrection where Welles' incarnation of the Shadow is concerned. Either he was a peerless visionary who was shackled by the juvenile confines of the Shadow and used it as a mere stepping stone to greater things, or he was a lech punching a time clock to fund his Mercury Theater productions, utterly bereft of creative investment of the product that would ultimately air. And the fact is that neither and both of those statements are fucking true. Orson Welles was busy as a coked-up Baccarat dealer for a fact. He was running a successful, federally funded theater company and bankrolling many of his productions illicitly with earnings from his radio work. In fact, President Roosevelt once jibed that Orson Welles was the only man to ever illegally siphon money into a government project. He didn't, in fact, have time for rehearsals, but by the same token, his towering talent was such that he scarcely goddamn needed them. Orson Welles, contrary to whatever the celluloid-huffing Citizen Kane-ophiles in the average film course would have you believe, did in fact enjoy The Shadow, a fact borne out by his stated intention, after completing Citizen Kane, to direct a film version of it. A project that fell through, likely due to film rights reasons. That's right, folks. We could have lived in a world with an Orson Welles film noir version of The Shadow, but never will thanks to a pencil-neck pissant railing underage models on a casting couch somewhere in amorphous 1940s-ville. Thanks, fuckstick, you're swell. While the show would find better footing with later actors, there's more than a few highlights in the Orson Welles regime. My personal favorite being the prophetic The Silent Avenger, a program that aired nearly 20 years before the Austin Bell Tower sniper literally invented the school shooting, yet that featured film noir veteran William Bendix of Blue Dahlia fame as a traumatized former military sniper, shell-shocked and beguiled by a bullshitting brother bound for the electric chair, into ascending an unnamed New York clock tower with a silent sniper rifle and gaining retribution against the courtroom that had convicted him, not to mention the governor, mayor, and police commissioner who had enabled them.
These people I told you about, the judge, the jury, that prosecuting attorney are the same ones that drafted you into the army, sent you over to France. Let you get shell-shocked so it's hard for you to remember things.
Sure. I won't forget.
Now, just one more thing. There's a guy that may get after you. He's smarter than the cops. He's the one that really got me. You gotta keep away from him. Don't give him a chance to find you.
Is he dead? Like all my buddies in the war? The ones that talk to me in the dark?
He ain't dead, he's alive. You can hear his voice, only you can't see him. You know those old hand grenades you have at home?
Yeah.
Well, I want you to carry a couple with you. If this guy ever finds you, if he tries to stop you paying him off for killing me, you just pull the pin of a hand grenade and throw it where you think his voice is coming from.
It's formulaic for a fact, but exceptional performances by Welles and Bendix elevated above other offerings from the Orson era. And you remember that bit I said about finding creative ways to off the bad guy without actually depressing a fucking trigger mechanism? Spoiler alert here, but for those who are more about the ride than the destination, brace yourselves for badass.
Don't you come near me, Shadow. Don't you touch me. If you do, I'll drop this hand grenade. I'll throw it down here among all those people. I've killed dozens of them. There. I'll pull the pin. I'll throw it.
Danny, hold that hand grenade, Danny. Hold it tight, Danny Brecker. See your fingers tighten about it. Your mind obeys mine. Don't throw that hand grenade.
Hold it. Hold it tight. Don't throw it.
Don't drop it. Don't drop it, Danny.
Don't drop it, Danny. Don't drop it, Danny. Don't drop it.
And like a murderous Mr. Rogers, no episode would be complete without a ham-fisted recitation of the moral message of the day.
Danny Brecker was an enemy of society. A killer. But only because you and I and countless thousands made him one. No, Commissioner. There is no glory in this for you, or the Shadow, or for any man.
The Silent Avenger is emblematic of Orson Welles as the Shadow. Topical, top-shelf crime drama in the first fucking degree. Next. While he wasn't born there, if there's one format where the Shadow truly lives, it's in the pulps. While the prose version actually spun out of radio, his mythos and by association the unofficial rulebook for all superheroes to follow would be generated in the pages of Pulpdom, with the radio Shadow upstaging the detective story magazine he was created to promote, and fans clamoring for that Shadow detective magazine. Before you can say flagrant commercial capitalization, they spun out a series, enlisting a former magician, crime writer, journalist, and ghostwriter for everyone from Harry Houdini to the great Blackstone named Walter B. Gibson. The series would be in good hands indeed. A kind of 1930s predecessor to James Randi, Walter Gibson had devoted much of his early writing career to debunking fake psychics, mediums, and carnival con men. And it was precisely this experience, with misdirection, sleight of hand, and familiarity with the world of crime, that made Mr. Gibson the ideal sire of the Shadow, with a blinding writing speed enabling him to crank out as much as 40 to 50 pages in a single day. The reason he was selected to help crank out a magazine in a matter of weeks is hardly one of the great mysteries of antiquity. Being fast would be fine enough, but the shit was good, with a breakneck pace, a mercifully short page count, rife with plot-driven action and morsel-sized chapters. Even if you're not much of a reader, I dare you to read a couple micro-chapters of one of the Shadow pulps and retain the ability to put it the fuck down. If you're daunted by the prospect of reading, consider that these Sanctum reprints, which smash 2, sometimes 3 Shadow stories together, are in fact no more thick than the average fucking graphic novel. If you can read overrated ferret shit like The Watchmen, you can damn sure read the pulps Alan Moore's been unrepentantly ripping the fuck off for his entire career. Walter Gibson, may he rest in peace, was one of the true treasures of American literature, a man who to this day holds the world record for most words typed by one person on any one fictional subject. And before you dismiss that statement as mere hyperbole, consider that there are just over 300 Shadow novels by the end, and Walter Gibson wrote 283 of them. Over 15 million words in all. Gibson is a god. The father of the modern superhero. The man DC Comics and Bob Kane specifically should be paying fucking royalties to. But more than that, one of the few sincere geniuses in his chosen field. And it all started on April Fool's Day 1931 with the living Shadow. When a down-on-his-luck victim of the Depression named Harry Vincent approaches the Brooklyn Bridge, steps to the edge, and prepares to end it all, he comes face to beak with justice. The fog was thick at the center of the bridge where Harry Vincent stood leaning against the rail. Mist, thick black mist, nothing but mist. It seemed to invite his plunge. Yet he hesitated, as many wait when they're upon the brink of death. Until, with a mad impulse, he swung his body across the rail and loosened his hands. Something clamped on his shoulder. An iron grip held him, balanced between life and death. Then, as though his body possessed no weight whatsoever, the man felt himself pulled around in a sweeping circle. He staggered as his feet struck the sidewalk of the bridge. He turned to confront the person who had interfered. He faced a tall, black-cloaked figure that might have represented death itself. For he could not have sworn in that moment that he was looking upon a human being. Thus is introduced perhaps the single most interesting and novel aspect of the Shadow character, his agents. Look, Batman's great and all, but money and resources notwithstanding, I've never bought that one twat with a trust fund, a butler, and a preteen chamber boy could police the largest metropolis on the East Coast. I don't care how many spy cameras he plants and satellites, or how hard they retcon the character into a living, breathing HAL 9000, that shit doesn't make even the beginnings of butt-fucking sense, and you and I both know it. But whereas Batman and Superman save a bitch and bug the fuck out, secure in the knowledge they did a good deed, when the Shadow plucks a hapless civilian from the jaws of mortality, he sends that bitch the bill.
You're Dr. Roy Tam, a professor in the science department at NYU.
Yes.
I've saved your life, Roy Tam. It now belongs to me.
It does?
Consequently, over the 300-plus Shadow novels, the Night of Darkness accrues a veritable standing army of agents in every disparate field, from communications to news reporting to organized crime, each owing the Shadow a mortal debt and each ready and willing to advance the cause of the Dark Avenger. Further, this story introduces Diamond Burt, one of the first recurring villains in the history of Pulps, laying the groundwork for perhaps Walter Gibson's greatest contribution to superhero fiction, the supervillain. While I'm recommending The Living Shadow specifically, take this as an implicit recommendation of the first 10 Shadow novels. The Living Shadow, The Eyes of the Shadow Laughs, The Red Menace, Gangdom's Doom, The Death Tower, The Silent Seven, The Black Master, Mobsman on the Spot, and Hands in the Dark. Each one shockingly addictive and eminently readable, each one adding a further element to the nebulous fictional universe that is the Shadow. If that seems a tall order, let's simplify matters. The Living Shadow. Read it! I think we're all instinctively aware of the seismic impact that Frank Miller's visionary The Dark Knight Returns had on comics, and even on society at large. While I personally have always felt that it's a little too wordy and somewhat overrated, there's still no denying the morally ambiguous ripple effect still reverberating through the industry at large. What far too few are aware of, however, is that the Shadow got his own answer to The Dark Knight Returns the same year as Batman, and just months apart, no less. What The Dark Knight Returns is to deconstructing and modernizing the aging Caped Crusader, Blood and Judgment is to the Shadow. The premise? After fighting crime for the majority of the 30s and 40s, the Shadow vanished. Flashing the fuck forward to the roaring 80s, as the Shadow's aging agents are mysteriously assassinated in what appear to be professional hits, remaining Shadow agents Margot Lane and Harry Vincent convene to discuss matters. And then, the Shadow shows up, without having aged a day. There's a logical explanation, but I hit my spoiler limit about 5 fucking minutes ago. Written and illustrated by graphic storytelling sage Howard Chaykin, perhaps one of the most polarizing firebrands in contempo comics. You either love his idiosyncratic, vaguely fetishized renderings of semi-naked broads in garters and fuck me pumps, or you don't. Me? Look, I can take it or leave it, but the story, melding disparate elements to form a kind of greatest hits of the Pulp's radio and comic incarnations, is not just one of the best Shadow stories ever told. This is objectively one of the greatest graphic novels of the 1980s, and I say that with every goddamn awareness. Bitch, you best buy Blood and Judgment. While some may balk at the numerical placement for this story, understand that this is no hard and fast ranking system, folks. I'm simply rattling these off in whatever order I see fit, because if you want to make the argument that 1937's Crime Insured is the greatest Shadow story ever written, you'll hear not a peep from my overly opinionated ass. A pulp that simultaneously subverts the heretofore infallibility of the Master of Darkness and explores the adverse consequences of long-term vigilantism in ways, for example, Batman Incorporated didn't get around to for, another 80 fucking years or so. I'd tell Grant Morrison to cram that in his crack pipe and smoke it, but I'm not sure there's anything left for that cornball cue ball to fucking smoke at this point. After 6 uninterrupted years of holding his boot to the neck of organized crime, the aforementioned criminals get fucking wise. Foiling routine robbery after routine robbery, the Shadow and his agents appear to have crime fighting down like clockwork, but unbeknownst to the Dark Avenger, a shadowy visage observes his every move and those of his agents, and assiduously notes their names, locations, and occupations down with masterly precision. Even the Shadow's agents Cliff Marsland and Hawkeye, both ingratiated with mobsters as cover, are ultimately discovered and captured. But before that happens, Marsland witnesses the very mobsters who carried out the failed crimes being paid out by an anonymous source, even though they failed to pull the crime off. The scam? Crime insurance. And the meticulous shadowy figure is Strumpf. Not an assassin, not a supervillain, but an insurance investigator. So meticulous is the Teutonic twat in question in observing the comings and goings of the Shadow and his agents that he ultimately uncovers virtually the entire organization, up to and including his communications officer, Burbank, kidnaps them to a man, and in perhaps his most brilliant flourish, traces Burbank's communications network back discovers the Shadow's hidden sanctum and razes it to the fucking ground. A riveting read. Crime Insured is basically every The Joker finds the Batcave story ever written about 60 years before DC did it. Next. While your mileage may differ, the Bill Johnstone regime of the radio show is something of a mixed bag. On the one hand, the show grew more lighthearted and comedic in nature, chiefly through the introduction of Shrevey in the Pulps, a capable cabbie and wheelman without peer, but in the radio drama, a bumbling, troglodytic, glorified chauffeur.
Oh, I get it. I'm going too fast, I'm going. Is that it, isn't it?
Oh, no, Shrevey. It's just that all the others are going so slowly.
Miss Slane, you're a genius. I never thought of it like that.
Hey, Shrevey, just because I criticize you for going so fast, there's no reason why you should stop on a dime.
No, Mr. Cranston, that ain't why I stopped. I just seen a pal I see.
Well, I hope you don't see any relatives.
But on the other hand, after cutting its teeth on the formulaic fare in the Orson era, the writing began to finally find its wings. And perhaps Bill Johnstone's greatest highlight is an episode entitled The Shadow Challenged. Quite literally plucked from the Pulps, namely a story entitled The Third Shadow, an imposter is darting about town pretending to be the Shadow. At first glance, hardly anything to phone the wife and kids about. But an ingenious production decision by director Bill Tuttle makes this one of the uncontested gems of the Shadow's near 20-year radio run, as cast opposite Bill Johnstone as the oddly convincing impersonator is none other than the original Shadow actor, Frank Reddick.
This is Lamont Cranston. Is there anyone here? Who is that?
Don't let me frighten you, Mr. Cranston. I'm your old friend, the Shadow.
You are not the Shadow?
No? How would you know that? Answer me.
I repeat, you are not the Shadow.
I see. And would your knowledge be based on the fact that you yourself are the Shadow? Would it, Mr. Cranston?
Old school meets new school. It's the radio equivalent of Michael Keaton versus Adam West, and it happened on the radio all the way back in 1941. Next. Now, with all this talk of the Shadow's matchless gunplay, mastery of misdirection, disguise, and outright stealth, you're probably thinking, fuck, this sounds like a damn fine premise for an open-world, black-and-white stealth video game series or some shit. Correct! And that, along with a parent company that treats the Shadow property more like a piggy bank than an IP, is precisely why it will never be made in 2016. Smoke 'em if you got 'em, asshole. But with the release of the Alec Baldwin Shadow film in 1994, the first and to date only attempt was made to bring the Night of Darkness to interactive media. Developed by Ocean Software, the very same brain trust that decreed Jurassic Park on the SNES didn't need a fucking save feature, the result was actually one of the better beat-em-ups of the 16-bit era. Or rather, it would have been if it hadn't been shit-canned mere months from its final release. And sadly, it wasn't alone, as plans for a 90s Shadow cartoon, shot in black and white and featuring the very same Art Deco art style that Batman the Animated Series swiped from the Shadow to fucking begin with, was reportedly given the heave-ho in a hurry. Punchin', kickin', hypnotic superpower, Shadow shoryukens, gunplay, and yes, the Shadow riding a motherfucking motorcycle. This game had it all. What it didn't have was that final coat of polish and game balancing that a final retail product required, and the net result is one of the better ROMs floating about the incorporeal ether of the internet gaming scene. If anyone is watching this and knows enough about programming to hack the occasional ROM, please, for the love of Lamont Cranston, finish this shit for the fucking rest of us. We will sing your praises from now until 3 centuries hence when they actually fucking option a Shadow movie reboot. But even in its unfinished state, barely ass functional, the Shadow on SNES is eminently recommended. Goddamn next! When ranking the Shadow radio actors, I find it can be simplified as follows. Orson Welles was the finest Lamont Cranston, hands the fuck down. From that faux Anglo-American aristocracy accent to the highly contrived air of practiced nonchalance, no one reeks old-world New England money quite so profoundly as Orson Welles' Lamont Cranston, in any medium.
This man claims to be the leader of a cult worshipping a deity known as the Ancient One.
Is there such a cult?
There was, but it was stamped out nearly 5 centuries ago because its ceremonies and rituals included human sacrifice.
Meanwhile, while his chuckle could use some work, Bill Johnstone's actual shadow voice, supplemented perfectly by his craggy voicecraft, may be the apex of all shadow actors.
The phenomenon called life is a delicate balance. To tamper with that balance is to upset it, and to upset it is to create a monster.
Ah, but the belle of the ball is Bret Morrison, featuring both the old-world austerity of Orson Welles and the cackling maniacal qualities of Johnstone's shadow. Bret Morrison is the best of both worlds. And as such, while this very same episode was originally recorded in 1940 by Bill Johnstone, the re-recorded 1946 version with Bret Morrison is the bitchinest of the bunch. Told via the very same framed narrative that Dragon Age 2 ear-fucked into the fourth dimension, it tells the tale of a down-on-his-luck alcoholic named Terry, played with aplomb by Richard Widmark, star of the British film noir masterpiece that is Night in the City. More on that later. After being institutionalized for alcoholism, the mental patient overhears mysterious music being played on a recorder, followed by strange limping footsteps preceding a series of gruesome murders.
And it was at night, too, that those notes in a minor key were heard. Faintly at first. Ever so faintly. Played on a strange instrument. Then as they came closer, you heard uneven, heavy-footed steps. The sounds are louder now. The footsteps nearer. 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 Well, I seem to be getting ahead of my story.
Enlisting the help of Lamont Cranston, the Shadow sets out to work unraveling the mystery with one of the first truly shocking twist endings of the radio serial era. The result is radio refined. I've recommended it on my blog in the past, but for those who haven't yet, listen to that shit. As I mentioned earlier, of all Walter Gibson's myriad pop culture innovations, from the pulp superhero's psychological underpinnings, to his exposure of false mediums and carnival hucksters, to everything Batman saw fit to steal, perhaps the greatest single contribution of all was his invention of the supervillain. In a pulp era where the story couldn't officially conclude until the baddie was being butt-fucked by Baphomet, Walter Gibson's painstaking record-keeping nature meant that he was always aware of the status of his villains. When the antagonist in The Living Shadow was jailed rather than killed, he almost accidentally happened upon the idea of bringing him back for repeat appearances. And the end result was the Chinese discs, one of the more climactic chapters in Shadow history. Impressed with the end results of that experiment, Gibson hereby decreed that if an arch-nemesis had perished in such a way that left room for even the vaguest ambiguity, they must in all likelihood return. And the finest of these, for yours truly, is the Voodoo Master, a kind of Warren Jeffs Jim Jones cult leader who in truth is motivated by little more than the pursuit of payola. His hypnotic power over the flotsam and jetsam of society turns them quite literally into zombies. With a Machiavellian mind and a flair for the dramatic to rival the Shadow's own, what Walter Gibson didn't fully appreciate at the time was that he was in the process of creating the very first rogues gallery in Pulp Fiction. You're welcome, DC and Marvel. Voodoo Master! Read it! The Dark Avengers' filmic history, to put it bluntly, is spottier than Michael Jackson's nuts. Beginning with paint-by-numbers fare like The Shadow Strikes and International Crime, both of which eschewed the character's rich fictional history in favor of a run-of-the-mill murder mystery, culminating in 2 failed television pilots and more false starts than a waterlogged Pinto and a mudslick. By the late 80s and early 90s, the character's success in comics, along with the money-printing properties of similar, plagiarized characters like Batman, persuaded Universal to attempt the first truly faithful adaptation of the character and world. Attached to Sam Raimi initially, when the studio blew the film's budget up and enlisted Jurassic Park scribe David Koepp, Raimi made a few selective changes to his script, and the end result was the delightfully redonkulous Darkman. And then Universal cast wide their checkbook and started throwing the money around, and Jesus fuck did they ever. Never mind a director fresh the fuck off Ricochet and The Highlander. Look at this fucking cast for a beat. Drink it the fuck in. Alec Baldwin, Penelope Ann Miller, Tim Curry, Peter Boyle, Ian McKellen, motherfucker. And with bleeding edge CGI and production design to rival the almighty Batman Returns, the money is splayed across the screen. And the script, while suffering from more than a few, shall we say, tonal issues,
next time you get to be on top.
is for the most part shockingly true to the original source material. While it's obvious the radio version provided major inspiration for the filmic adaptation, from dual-wielding automatics to the laundry list of agents, the Shadow's sanctum, and even certain aspects of the original Kent Allard origin story, albeit dovetailed into a clearly defined Lamont Cranston alter ego, there's more than a little pulp in the OJ here regardless. And color me crazy, but I kinda dig the added wrinkle of Margot Lane being psychic, providing the character with a reason to exist outside of the compulsory kidnapping in the second act. Look, it's not perfect, but as a cornerstone of the 90s pulp movie triumvirate along with The Rocketeer and The Phantom, I have to be honest. The Shadow is probably the best of the bunch, and by extension, one of, if not the finest examples of a superhero film generated by the numbnuts of the 90s. Next! While I've regaled you all with the travails of the Shadow on celluloid, what I conveniently failed to mention was that as early as 1940, someone actually got it fucking right. One glorious summer, Shadow fans were treated to perhaps the finest 15-week black and white serial ever made, and in a spasm of common sense, the writers actually consulted with Walter fucking Gibson. The end result? The Shadow, replete with slouch hat, gloves, cape, and face mask, two-fisted 45s like a motherfucker. Harry Vincent's in this bitch. Margot Lane is... Harry Vincent's in this bitch! And with a story adapted from disparate pulp issues like The Green Hoods, The Lone Tiger, Silver Skull, and The Golden Vulture, the lineage to the original source material is immutable. Sure, about 12 ceiling collapses in, you realize you're being treated to a double dollop of dick cheese, but that's black and white serials, baby. Kick back with a Coke and a burger and fucking enjoy it, because The Shadow is a paragon of popcorn viewing. Starring Victor Jory, I believe, best known to the uninitiated as Jonas Wilkerson, the vicious plantation overseer in Gone with the Wind, and possessor of the most princely proboscis this side of a fucking toucan, he was tailor-made to play the Shadow. Not only has much of the radio version's vapidity been shed in favor of action and forensics, but in a complete inversion of the radio drama, it's the fucking villain who can turn himself invisible. The mysterious Black Tiger, a faceless business magnate who evidently belongs to Lamont Cranston's sodality of high society suck-ups, communicates wirelessly to his various henchmen, all of whom are oblivious to his true identity, as one by one he removes his corporate competition. Think Steve Jobs with more white blood cells. The Shadow is a riveting whodunit, with some of the finest cliffhangers and most ludicrous last-minute escapes ever burned to a length of film. If you have a friend over, whether they dig The Shadow or not, and just want to treat him to some badass action-adventure viewing with a twist of yellow peril slap-a-jap racism...
All right, that's all. Oh, thank you.
The Shadow is the cure for what ails ya. Well, that does it, folks. Hopefully that presents a decidedly more inclusive introduction to the Shadow mythos than my previous comic recommendations video. I'm RazörFist. The weed of crime bears bitter fruit. Crime does not pay. The Shadow knows.
When I used to listen, on the radio, when you were the Shadow, that was this was one of the most exciting for, especially for, when you would, when you would say, first of all, that sinister, that ha-ha, you know what I'm, and when you would say, what evil, it was the kind of thing it would convey to especially to an impression, to a child. What I was talking when I was back, I said, if only the thing that I would if I could only make magical things, what I would like you to do, what I have dreamed, if you could cloud, do what when you used to cloud, you would cloud people, you would turn people's, you would cloud people's, you could cloud people's. Mr. Wells? Oh, this is fantastic. I knew this was so mad. He has actually beclouded, Mr. Orson. He has actually beclouded my mind. Oh! Oh, Mr. Wells.